Hello and welcome back to Practical Christian Lessons. I am with Dr. Michael Flowers today, and we are going to be talking about Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. If you don't know who Dr. Michael Flowers is, shame on you. Go watch his videos. I'll have his channel linked below, and including at least one playlist and some videos, if not two playlists, from you on these two particular passages. Feel free to add anything else you want to this introduction. But I know you've done your PhD on Psalm 22, if I'm correct.
No. My PhD was in it was working in Q, and so I was looking at the Messianic Forerunner concept in Q.
Yep.
So the Psalm 22 is just an article that I wrote.
So unlike me, he's an actual professional academic. I'm just an amateur out here, but I'm catching up slowly but surely. But we're going to be sort of looking at some of the, I'd say, errors and some of the flaws in how at least some of the scholarship kind of approaches these two passages, and I think mishandle and misappropriate the text, and will say some things that just kind of go against what's going on. Not that everybody does this, but there is a fairly large amount in my experience. At least they're very vocal when they're doing this. Maybe you have a bit of a different experience there, but I tend to hear about it an awful lot in my circles.
People want to act as if the like ideology doesn't play a part, but it always does.
Yeah, so. Yeah. Everyone's got their biases, and I can't remember who it is that's always saying this in like most of his videos. Everyone's got their biases. You have to account for your bias. You can't just ignore bias, but you have to acknowledge everyone has a bias. So
yeah, including yourself.
Yeah. Every time I hear Dan McClellan, what is it he says? Dogma over.
Oh yeah, data over dogma.
Data over dogma. I'm just like, okay, Dan, your videos really don't show that either, but here we are.
Yeah, it's funny, like, because I went to Westminster. Well, I started off at Westminster, and then I transferred to Gordon Conwell. But I've always enjoyed, Cornelius Van Til, Greg Bahnsen, some of those presuppositionalists and stuff. And one of the things they always emphasize is that data doesn't speak for itself. The stuff that counts as data in the first place is gathered, it's interpreted, and it's evaluated in light of your other beliefs and, ideology, basically.
Yeah.
And there's just no real awareness of that on the part of some people.
Yeah. We have to interpret things. It doesn't just get like beamed into our heads. Everyone has to interpret. Right. Who was it talked about? History is as much a game of looking at the facts as interpreting the facts for your readers. I can't remember who. I'm paraphrasing them. I can't remember who said that. But that's every historian is interpreting when they're writing. There's no one who just throws data points in a book. Well, one, because no one would read it if all you're doing is putting data points. But not nobody.
Yeah,
most people.
Well, think about how much data there is. I remember this is kind of funny. This is maybe a tangent, but I was on a bus one time in the UK, and this guy in the seat ahead of me had a book that was just called Data. I was like, so I asked him, what is that? He's like, oh, it's for a class I'm taking. And I'm like, a class? It's like, or no, I think the book was on information. It was just called Information. And I said, what are you studying? He's like, information. It's like, how do they sort of narrow that down? It's like everything's information.
Yeah.
And history is the same way. It's like, you couldn't write a history book without like being selective, And so, and everything's kind of that way. Whatever we're talking about, if we're interpreting the Bible or coming up with theology and stuff, you're always going to be selective in the data that you're looking at.
Yeah.
So, okay. So in the Hebrew Bible, Psalm 22:17, it's 16 in the English Bible, I believe. We have this phrase, and this is the way it reads in the Masoretic text. You've got Ka'ari Yadai Veraglai, right? Now that doesn't really make any sense. It just means like the lion, my hands and my feet. So for a long time, scholars have wondered, maybe there's some kind of corruption here. And if you look at the Septuagint reads, they dug my hands and my feet. So here's what it looks like if you write, they dug my hands and my feet, which would correspond to the Septuagint. You see karu, and you can spell it in two different ways, either with or without this aleph right here. So the Aleph, back before they had this type of vocalization, this is the way they write vowels now with
the Masoretic text.
Yeah, the Masoretes came up with this type of vocalization where you insert like dots and like little symbols and things underneath or inside or above the characters. But before that, they used to use a different system. So they would insert an aleph, for example, to correspond to a long A vowel, because Hebrew doesn't have any vowels. Originally, it didn't have any vowels, and so they've had to come up with a way to sort of insert those into the text. So this is what they would do sometimes. So this just kind of, you would sound this out as a long A. So it sounds the same as this here. And so scholars have speculated that maybe what happened was the scribe who was copying the Septuagint read this in his exemplar, Kaf, Aleph, Resh, Vav. And so he interpreted that as this verb here, kara, which takes on that other form when it's in the third person plural. And so, so that's kind of how this has been discussed in the literature. And so you've got really these two, and then turns out that we actually have recently discovered two manuscripts, both from the Dead Sea region, one from the Qumran scrolls and another one from Nahal Hever, which is in the Dead Sea area. And they both seem to support this this reading that corresponds to the Septuagint. So this is the Nahal Hever manuscript, and you can see it's real faded. And what I've done is I've tried to redraw those characters and stuff. So the characters that we'd be looking at are these right here. Here's a Kaf, an Aleph, a Resh, and a Vav, right? So Karu. So that would support that reading that I was talking about. And then the one from the Qumran scrolls, it's kind of disappointing that we didn't find more Psalm 22 copies from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we do at least have this one. And sadly, it kind of breaks off right at the key place. Here's Klavim, Adat, and then right here is the part that we would want to be looking at. So it'd be something like this. Okay, so there's Hikifuni, which means they surrounded or encompassed. So the kola that we're talking about, or the line, they dug my hands and my feet, it would start right here, not right here. This is the ending of this line. So here it is. Karu is the way I reconstruct it. And I do that on the basis of these little marks here. And the marks have flaked off on this particular photograph, but they have some earlier photographs where you can see these marks, where the white is where the marks were. These two marks here, I'm interpreting these as the two crests on this Kaf. And then this one here as the crest on this Resh. And then we can't see anything on this Vav here, but if these two letters are correct, then this would have to be a Vav, because what else is it going to be? It can't be a Yod, because that's not a word. So that would be Karu, which is the shorter form of that same word for they dug. So this one here, the shorter one. So from Qumran, we've got the shorter form, and from Nahal Hever, we've got this longer form. And those correspond, as I said, to the Septuagint. And so we seem to have corroboration now of this earlier reading. So that's all kind of something that has come to light in recent years. Okay, so all of that just as kind of a setup. And so which of these is the best reading? I wonder if it'd be better just to go to this right here. There we go. So here's the Septuagint, actually. Oruxan is the word for they dug. And then here is a medieval manuscript that attests to the Karu reading. Then the Peshitta kind of matches with the they dug. It means something kind of like they pierced. And then Aquila is another early translation that could kind of support at least the third person plural verb reading, as opposed to like reading it as a noun, as lion. because it actually has a third person plural verb here, Eis hunan, which means they put to shame or they disgraced my hands and my feet. So it doesn't match either the Masoretic text or this other Septuagint reading, but it does match the Septuagint, at least in the sense that it's interpreting that word, whatever they read there, as a third person plural verb as opposed to a noun. So probably Aquila was reading a vav for that third or fourth letter. So this right here, he was reading a vav. Where do the scholars kind of, like, why don't they follow the Septuagint reading? I'll just call it the Septuagint reading, just keep it simple. But remember, there's also some Hebrew manuscripts that support it too. One of the reasons they say, well, it doesn't really even make sense to say they dug my hands and my feet. I mean, what would that even mean? I know Dan McClellan has done some videos on this, and he says, the word kara doesn't mean pierce. And Kip Davis also has insisted on this. It can't possibly mean pierce, you know. And the way I see it is, first of all, it's not totally clear that the word kara couldn't mean pierce. And I go into that in one of my videos. There is some philological evidence to suggest that it could have meant pierce. But even if that's not true, you have to keep in mind that we're dealing here with poetry, right?
Yeah.
And also, well, I'll get to that in a second. But as far as the poetry goes, words can be used in ways that are not typical. And so that needs to be borne in mind. So maybe the author was being a little bit poetic, invoking some poetic license here. And there's also the difference between denotation versus connotation. Denotation is kind of like the strict definitional meaning of a word. So Dan will say that dig, the word dig in Hebrew and in Greek, refers to a removal of material, right, from some place like the ground or whatever. And it's the same way in English too, right? So the word dig. But then if we talk about the connotation of a word, there's a little bit more latitude, right? So I could say the cat dug its claws into my skin, as she often does. In fact, last week I had a piercing right here in my hand that would have looked kind of interesting considering the topic that we're discussing.
Yeah.
So that's a way that we use the term a little bit more loosely. Or, you know, he really dug in his heels, you know, as I confronted him on this issue or whatever.
Yep.
So we use the term to mean, it doesn't always have to mean a removal of material. Okay, so maybe that's kind of something that's going on. And then secondly, at around the turn of the era, prophecies were thought to be very ambiguous. That was just the assumption that everybody had, was that prophecies, oracles, were by nature very mysterious, very ambiguous. And so you had to kind of struggle to understand what they meant. So you think of like the oracle at Delphi. Do you remember the story in Thucydides, I think, where King Croesus, the king of Lydia, he consulted the oracle at Delphi, and he said, if I go to war against the Persians, will I win? And the oracle came back and said, if you go to war against the Persians, you will destroy a great nation. Right? And he took that to mean that he's going to destroy the Persians. But it turned out what it really meant was that he was going to destroy his own nation.
Yeah.
So you get like these kinds of oracles like this where it's ambiguous, right? And Josephus talks about this ambiguous oracle when people are not totally sure which oracle he has in mind there. But, you know, that was the idea, that oracles are not always straightforward. And so people kind of look at them, and Dan talks about how you'd squint at it and you could maybe make it out to mean something. Well, that's kind of what they did back then. When they were looking at these prophecies, you know, some of the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, that's kind of how they looked at it, was we do need to kind of squint and try to figure out, you know, and they had lots of hermeneutical strategies for interpreting these prophecies too. They would look at words that would match other texts of scripture that also seem to talk, you know, like the Messiah was understood to be or he was spoken about as a rock, as a cornerstone. And so they would bring texts together using this principle called Gizerah Shawah. where you have like similar wording in one text that causes you to bring it together with another text and then read those texts in light of one another. Now, that's not the sort of thing you would learn in seminary these days or graduate school or something like that.
Yeah.
Because that kind of presupposes that the Bible was inspired by God and that God has, given us these sort of breadcrumbs to kind of put two and two together and all that. So if you're approaching scripture from a purely secular standpoint, then you're going to kind of miss some of this stuff, right? Yeah. And you're not going to see the connections. But, and I think that's kind of Dan's problem is he approaches it as a purely secular book, and he doesn't take into account some of the hermeneutical principles that were at work in the time of Christ.
Yeah. And I know I've covered that. I'll probably link this below too. I've got my own Messianic series where I've kind of walked through that, showing how, clearly the Bible itself painted this picture, like Genesis 3 being, the first prophecy that then linked into Genesis 12 and 15 that then got linked into Genesis 49 and got picked up as Numbers 24. And it's like this just chain of texts that keep going. I know there are good books on that, like How to Study the Bible's Use of the Bible and the Old Testament use of the Old Testament. Kind of dig into that if anyone's interested. But yeah, like you're saying, a lot of the skeptics don't view the Bible as a unified work. So for them, they're just like, no, these are separate texts. That's not a valid way to read the Bible. But that's how the people who read it. So
yeah, and especially like when you talk about reception history, because we're talking about how the Bible was understood in the first century when Christianity was starting to emerge. They were definitely working with different principles of interpretation. So what are some of the other objections that they have? So some people... go ahead.
I know one, Michael Rydelnik notes this one. It's that the Masoretic rendering is the harder rendering, so you should go with the harder rendering. I don't think that's a very compelling case myself, but I do know that is a case some people make, is if, when possible, go with the reading that is the hardest to understand. That's likely the most likely one, because otherwise they wouldn't have preserved it. I'm not very convinced by that argument, but
yeah, I don't know how it would be harder. The problem with the Masoretic reading is that it doesn't have a verb. So you could say that that's kind of hard to understand. It's like you have to ask, well, what's the relationship between the lion and my hands and my feet, right? If there's no verb to kind of correlate those two or three nouns, then it's just not even clear what's being said there. Yeah. But you could also argue that they dug my hands and my feet is the more difficult reading, because it feeds into Christian understandings of prophecies about Jesus. And so the Jews would have had a vested interest in trying to suppress it.
Yeah.
So it's harder in that sense.
Yeah, which happened. Yeah, that happened quite a few times in the Masoretic text. Michael Rydelnik in his essay in the Moody Handbook of Prophecy goes through several examples. As he puts it, they took the historical reading over the traditional Messianic reading that was common in older Hebrew, in the Septuagint, in various things like the Targums, where they clearly understood a text to be pointing forward to the coming Messiah. They would often put the vowel pointers and interpret it in such a way to be more historical, relating to something happening, like taking certain texts and rendering it in a way that made it seem it was about David specifically, rather than pointing forward to someone to come after him, stuff like that.
I just thought of another objection that Kip Davis has raised. This one, he says that you can. So, oh, that's weird. I have two cursors on my screen. Okay, so I'll try to use this one. I think is that one on the Vav right now, and the Resh and the Aleph?
Yes.
Okay. So what Kip Davis tries to argue is that this fourth character in the word karu is not a Vav, but it's a Yod, right? The problem with that interpretation, though, is I think it's pretty clear. I mean, especially since it's right next to another Yod, or not another Yod, but it's right next to a Yod. And here's a Yod here too. And here's a Yod. So you can see that the scribe was purposely differentiating between his Vavs and his Yods. So I don't think there's much dispute as to what this character is. It's a Vav, which means it's a third person verb. It's not a noun. So you can't really read this as like the lion. You'd have to read it as they dug Or if you want to try to say that this comes from some other word, like maybe Kaf Aleph Resh as the root instead of Kaf Resh Hey, then you can make that argument. And some people have tried to make that argument too. I talk about that in my article. Some people would say that there was this hollow verb with Aleph as the center character in that verb, at least in the lexical form. And they say that it would have meant something like bind. So they bound my hands and my feet. But they base that on an Arabic cognate term. And I don't think the connection is quite as clear as they want to make it seem. So I can't remember exactly what my argument was against that, but I remember not being convinced by that argument, and I argue against it in my article.
I think it's worth just people thinking that, the debate over this text, though, may seem small to some people, as a bunch of people have pointed out. There's a reason people object so strongly against trying to render this as pierced or dug. And that's because if you render it as pierced or dug, it very clearly has messianic reading. Like it's unavoidable that this is talking about something to come. I know, as Justin Martyr put it, what king fulfilled this prophecy in his dialogue with Trypho? No king in Israel fulfilled it but Jesus. So there is a serious stake to have in this debate, especially as the New Testament authors take this and psalm and directly apply it to Jesus on the cross. So there's a lot.
Oh yeah. So that's one of the things that Tovia Singer says too, is that if this text had said they pierced or they dug my hands and my feet, then surely the New Testament authors would have quoted this text, but they never do. But what they do, though, is they frame the whole crucifixion scene in light of Psalm 22. So you got to ask yourself, why are they gravitating toward that chapter? And like, to me, the obvious question, or the obvious answer to that is because it had this key text in it that said they pierced or they dug my hands and my feet. Now, another thing that Tovia Singer tries to argue is that as far as the Septuagint goes, that was just a Christian translation, because the Septuagint only included the first 5 books of Moses, and the other books that were translated the translations were done by Christians. Yeah. And he says that this is just standard scholarship. It's not, though. It's not standard scholarship. There were Jewish authors who were quoting from the Psalms before Christianity. And the wording matches what we have in later Christian manuscripts, like, Vaticanus or Alexandrinus or whatever. Yeah, those are Christian copies, but they match with the earlier Jewish authors who quote from the Septuagint. Yeah. Or if you don't want to call it Septuagint, you call it the Old Greek or whatever you want to call it. But
I know in my Canada video I brought this up. It was like Tovia here, took something that is true and then mixed it with a lie, where it's like, it is true the original Septuagint was just the first 5 books, but a bunch of other Greek translations come up, like you already mentioned Aquila. And I know Anthony Collins, one of the old critical scholars from the 1700s, I want to say, mentioned I think it was Aquila who heard about the suffering servant from the Christians and almost converted just from that argument alone, and that came from texts like Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. So yeah, definitely not just a Christian invention, as Tovia Singer likes to claim constantly. So if anyone doesn't know about the Isaiah 53 debate, though I think from context of Isaiah itself, it's pretty clear what the answer is. There's the debate of who is the servant mentioned in Isaiah 52 through 53. If it's an individual, then of course the question is who's the individual, but most people will take it the obvious pointer forward is a messianic pointing forward to the Messiah to come. One of the common objections that people will kind of give out is that servant mentioned is not an individual, it's the nation of Israel. There are other objections, of course, people will throw out with that. I just think that doesn't make sense in the context. But you'll get, especially, from the rabbinic Jewish tradition from 6th and 7th and then 11th and 12th, or maybe 12th and 13th century, where they really have key figures that start defining their tradition by its opposition to Christianity. They start reinterpreting a lot of these older texts, where Isaiah 53, in these oldest interpretations we found, Christian and non-Christian, is this messianic pointer forward. But there's also other objections and ways people will also try and work things into that, which I'm sure you're much more familiar with than I am.
Here's Dan McClellan, Hellboy, saying Isaiah 53 was never interpreted as a prophecy about the Messiah until the followers of Jesus needed it to be. And then Bart Ehrman here says, we have no evidence that any Jew prior to Christianity ever thought that Isaiah 53 was about the Messiah. And I just don't agree with that. I know there are Christians too who say that this passage was not understood messianically until, and you could interpret the data either way. It's not going to, like, there are Christians who see it as a uniquely Christian interpretation, and there are Christians who see it as an earlier Jewish interpretation that was latched onto by Christians later on. So that's not really an argument that you can make against whatever position you come down on. Like Dan will say, well, Christians just, they invented this whole cloth. It's like, okay, well, if they invented a whole cloth, it kind of makes sense if you look at it that way, because it does kind of sound like a prophecy about Jesus, or you could say that this was in an earlier Jewish interpretation that the Jews later abandoned because they saw that it kind of fit really well with Christianity. Isaiah 53 opens up with this verse that says, he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root. So the terminology here, the root, right, is very reminiscent of another passage in the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, which is also, that was and still is regarded as a messianic prophecy by Jews, even though they don't see Isaiah 53 as a prophecy about the Messiah. And it's very clear in that chapter that that term, the root of Jesse, Sheresh Yishai is the term. That's the same word that shows up here for root, Sheresh. And so using that old principle, Gezerah Shawah, that I mentioned, it would have felt very natural for interpreters to bring these two texts together and to see Isaiah 53 as a further elaboration on what the Messiah of chapter 11 was going to do. So I talk about that in my video if anybody wants to check that out.
And again, for everybody, all of his videos and the article on Psalm 22 will be linked below. So if you're interested in those, check in the doobly doo.
Yeah, thanks. So a couple of things about this passage. Now, once again, if we bring in like some of the Dead Sea Scroll readings, there's a verse, the passage actually starts in chapter 52, not 53. So, interpreters have noticed this, for a long time now, that the so-called, what is it, the third servant song? Fourth servant song?
I think this is the fourth one.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And so it starts up here in Isaiah 52, verse 13, and extends to 53, verse 12. So starting there, it says, behold, my servant Avdi shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. And many were astonished at him. So his appearance was a blemish, more than a man. And this line here is kind of clunky. And so once again, in the past, even before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, commentators have wondered that maybe there's some kind of corruption here. We don't know what it is, but something strange is going on here. So then we discovered the great Isaiah scroll, Isaiah 1Q Isaiah A actually reads something a bit different here. Instead of reading mishchat, which would mean blemish, it reads mashchati, which means I have anointed. So it would read like this then. So I have anointed his appearance beyond that of a man. So you can see how it differs from the standard Masoretic text. Now that's very interesting because, as you know, and most people know, this verb mashach, here it's mashchati, comes from the verb mashach, which means to anoint, and it's related to the noun Mashiach, which means Messiah. And so this would have also pointed interpreters to the idea that this mysterious servant figure in Isaiah 52 and 53 is none other than the Messiah that was referred to, remember, Isaiah 11. So linking those two together, it would have kind of made sense. For he grew up like a young plant. There's some of that vegetative terminology once again. And like a root out of dry ground, sheresh. Remember, that's the same verb or the same noun that shows up in Isaiah chapter 11. Verse 1, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. And then in verse 10, in that day the root, sheresh, of Jesse shall stand as an ensign to the peoples. Or you could say as a banner. Some Christians have interpreted this as a reference to the cross. So then you can see, using that principle that I mentioned, Gezer HaShoah, they would have been led to bring this text together with the one in Isaiah 53 verse 2. Now, another objection that people have is that, right here, verse, 10? Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. He has put him to grief. When he makes himself a guilt offering, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. So one of the objections that people raise against this is they say, you see, this couldn't be talking about Jesus because he didn't have any seed. He didn't have any children. There are some problems, though, when you take that approach. Most Jewish interpreters seem to understand seed as referring to literal descendants, especially the people of Israel. Even interpreted like this, however, a Christian could point out that a messianic interpretation is not hereby excluded, since the verse could then connect quite nicely with another messianic prophecy in Psalm 22, the same psalm that we were just talking about. So it says in verse 31, a seed or offspring shall serve him. And this could be understood as the nation of Israel serving God, or the nation of Israel serving the Messiah. Psalm 22 was, in fact, interpreted messianically, at least in the Psalm Midrash. So they understood this as referring to the Messiah, that the seed would be serving the Messiah. Then there's another bigger problem here, because the term zerah, right here, zerah, so this could actually just be a scribal corruption for zero, which would mean his arm, or perhaps Zeroah Adonai, the arm of the Lord. And so if you interpret it like this, if we conjecture some kind of textual corruption here, then we could say that the expression connects with verse 1, where the arm is used as a metaphor for God's redemptive power or salvation. And I link a video by Michael Brown. He talks about that. Yep. Okay, so if it does say that he shall see seed, then you could still interpret that maybe metaphorically as just referring to the nation of Israel, or maybe even to his disciples or something like that. Or you could posit that there was some kind of textual corruption that happened. And so instead of seeing his descendants, he sees God's redemptive power, right?
Yep.
So there's two different ways to approach that alleged problem. And then in Isaiah 53, verse 11, we have this curious reading in the Masoretic text that says, out of the travail of his soul he shall see, full stop. Don't read this just yet. So what does that mean? Out of the travail of his soul he shall see. Well, you can use the word see in Hebrew. That's the verb ra'ah. You can use it intransitively. It's so grammatically this is possible to read it that way, but usually when you have a sentence like this, you expect the verb to function transitively. So there needs to be some kind of object. So once again, commentators in the past have toyed with the idea that maybe there was some kind of corruption that happened here, and they had the Septuagint to sort of build on, because the Septuagint adds the word phos, ta phos, as the direct object. So he shall see light, right? And then it turns out that in the manuscripts from Qumran have kind of corroborated this. So that's been another very interesting development in the study of this text, is that now we have some further corroboration for this noun light being part of the text. Now, what would that mean? He shall see light. Well, if you know anything about the way light is used in the Old Testament, there are lots of verses that talk about light as kind of a metaphor for life, right? So Christians would naturally interpret this as referring to the resurrection of Christ. He shall see light means that he will live again. And we've already heard him, the text talks about how he will die, he will suffer and die for the sins of his people. And so now we've got this verse. And then right after that, it says, so he shall succeed and he shall prolong his days. So he dies. So if he dies, how's he prolonging his days? But it makes sense to say he prolongs his days if he is raised from the dead. Does it make sense?
Yes, sir. And I also think of, like, we talked about Psalm 22, Psalm 21, I think it's 21, maybe it's Psalm 20 and 23, both then are also taken in that way by a lot, including in the Targums. I know at least on one of those Psalms, it just translated as, he will have eternal life in the midst of those. So it's not just an idea here in Isaiah. We also see it in that Psalm 22 it might be connected to with the surrounding passages.
Yeah, and then we've also got the Isaiah Targum that actually does interpret this chapter messianically. Now, what's curious, though, so you can see in verse 13 of chapter 52, behold my servant Messiah. So it doesn't just say my servant, but it adds the word Messiah there, which shows very clearly that they were interpreting this as a reference to the Messiah. But curiously, what they do in this Targum, the Targum, by the way, was an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew. So these were popular after the return from exile, and they started to become increasingly popular as Hebrew became less well known. So you have like the story of Ezra. He's reading the scriptures, and then it says that he interprets those for the people. So what he's doing is he's giving an Aramaic rendition or interpretation or something. These were some of the earliest translations, I think even before the Septuagint, of the Hebrew scriptures. But what's curious about this Targum is that even though they interpret the servant as the Messiah, what they do is they distance him from all the suffering. So the Messiah is not the one who suffers. Instead, it's Israel who suffers. So it's kind of strange because there's another interpretation that shows up. It's already mentioned by Origen, and so it probably goes back to the 2nd century or so at least, where the servant is understood as a reference to Israel, which matches with other texts in the book of Isaiah where the servant is actually identified as Israel. So the Targum, what it does is it's kind of combining those two interpretations, the one that sees the servant as the Messiah, but then also the other one that sees the servant as the nation of Israel. So it's kind of holding both of those together in some strange way. But they're butchering the translation in the process because it's no longer a translation. It's really just an interpretation. And then we have some evidence too from later Jewish writings, the Babylonian Talmud, for example, where the figure in Isaiah 53 is understood to be the Messiah, like this passage in what is this?
Sanhedrin.
Yeah, the Tractate Sanhedrin. So it says, his name is the pale-skinned one, which it's kind of like the leper, who is with Rabbi Ben Yehuda Hanassi, as it is written, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. That's quoting from Isaiah 53, obviously. They're talking about the Messiah here. So they're giving his name. What's the name of the Messiah going to be? And this Rabbi Ben Yehuda, or wait, who is this that's talking? I don't know who's the rabbi that's talking here. This might be a Baraita, which is like an unattributed tradition. And in a lot of cases, those are like the older traditions. So, but here we have the Messiah being called the pale-skinned one, and he quotes as a proof text this passage from Isaiah. So he's identifying the Messiah as this servant figure in Isaiah 53. And then in some of the early midrashes, we also have the same thing where the servant is being interpreted as the Messiah. There's that one. There's one that was really interesting. So the Ruth Rabbah is another one. Commenting on Ruth 2:14, which I'm not sure what that says, but it says, "Come hither." What does that mean? And dip your morsel in the vinegar. This refers to the chastisements of the Messiah, as it is written, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities." Okay, and then there's some more that you can look at. There was another one that was, I think it's this one. Yeah, so this one, this is from the Sifra on Leviticus. And this goes back to Rabbi Yosei the Galilean. So interestingly, the same part of Israel where Jesus lived. And this rabbi died in AD 135. So quite early. This tradition could go back even to the 1st century. And look what he says. They attribute goodness to then will the King Messiah, who endures affliction and pains for the transgressions, as is written, he was wounded and so forth, and he shall justify all nations. And this is what he meant when he said, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So he's interpreting this once again as a reference to the Messiah. And there's another rendition of this tradition which doesn't have anything about the Messiah in it. And so some people have said, oh yeah, this one here is a corruption of this earlier one, right? And now here's where I would say the argument that your friend was using about Psalm 22:16 would make more sense, where you say that we should look at the more difficult reading as probably the more likely original. Because this one that doesn't have anything about the Messiah in it would have fit better with Jewish attitudes and perspectives at a later time. Because Christians, they knew that Christians were really appealing to this Isaiah 53 passage as a proof text for the fact that the Messiah would have to die. So it seems more likely to me that they would have transformed this text into this version here than that they would have taken this one as the original one and then transformed it into this, where it talks about the Messiah, because that would just be giving away the farm. He'd be saying basically that Christians, you guys were right. This is actually talking about the Messiah. So I think it's far more likely that this one was the corruption, because they were trying to get rid of any kind of suggestions that this early rabbi had interpreted this text as a reference to the Messiah.
Yep. And I guess due credit to Rashi where it's due, at least he was open about it in several places when he said this is better against the Christian interpretation. At least he was honest in that respect to what he was doing.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people will say that, those traditions that you've mentioned from the Babylonian Talmud and the Sifra and Leviticus and the one from Rabbi Yosei, those are all post-Christian, right? So they're after the time of the New Testament. So I guess what they would say is that these Jews heard Christians using Isaiah 53 and interpreting that as a prophecy about the Messiah, and then they kind of latched onto it and said, oh yeah, this is talking about the Messiah, which doesn't make any sense. Why would they do that? Yeah. We know that they were very hostile to this Christian interpretation. And so I can't see why they would do that, So I think that even though the evidence doesn't go all the way back to the 1st century, I think it's most plausible to think that it did go back to the 1st century. And in fact, it actually does go back to the 1st century BC, because we have that Isaiah scroll, right? Where it interprets Isaiah 52 verse 13, where it says, I have anointed his appearance beyond that of a man. So I just think that it's pretty difficult to deny that interpretation goes back to Judaism before Christianity. And we have some further evidence of that from the parables of Enoch and from 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch. These books all date to the 1st century or maybe the early 2nd century. I guess, once again, even with these, you could say that they post-date Christianity, but are you really going to say that? Like, that just seems like
and as you said, like, doesn't that hurt their case, especially if, I know Robert Alter talked about this in his works translating the Old Testament. He's like, scribes had a very high reverence for the Torah, and they would often keep things that maybe didn't make a bunch of sense, and you could tell they kind of struggled with it because they thought it was the original writing. So I like with you, I think it would make more sense for them to be continuing ancient tradition when they're taking things that they actively try to fight and reject in other places.
Yep. So this all gets kind of complicated, so I probably shouldn't go into all this right now. But if people want to check out my videos, I talk about the connections between all these texts here and how interpreters in the 1st century would have very likely brought them together and interpreted them all as a reference to the Messiah. I mean, look here in Zechariah, you've got this reference to my servant, the branch, Tzemach, which again, it's that whole metaphor of the, you think of like a tree that's been cut down and all that's left is a trunk. And then you've got this branch that's emerging. It's the same sort of metaphor that shows up in Isaiah chapter 4 and Isaiah 53, slightly different terminology, but the same kind of idea that you have like the life is not completely cut off. Even though the tree has been cut down, there's going to spring up this new life from the tree. And especially in Isaiah chapter 11, it's very clearly referring to a messianic figure there. So all of these texts would have been kind of interpreted in light of one another as a kind of to give a fuller view of what the Messiah was going to do. If you understand Jewish interpretation at the time of the New Testament, this is kind of what they were doing. And so it all sort of makes sense. You can at least understand where the Christian interpretation would have come from. And one last thing I'll mention is, okay, so it's talking here about the branch, the righteous branch. Again, these were understood as messianic prophecies. And then it uses this expression, I will raise up for David a righteous branch. I will raise up, or I will cause to spring forth. There's other verses that talk about how God will raise up this figure that is going to be like the Messiah. Now, if you just read that in English, it doesn't strike you as anything that would necessarily fit with Jesus. But the word raise up is the same word that is used for the resurrection in both Hebrew and Greek. And so early interpreters, once again, could have seen these prophecies as adumbrating the coming resurrection of Jesus. So I think there's a lot of evidence and a lot of grounds for thinking that at the time of Jesus, this chapter or 2 chapters would have been understood as a messianic prophecy. And but then because it didn't really sit well with some of the preconceptions of what the Messiah was supposed to do or not do within Judaism, that this interpretation was then abandoned. And so then it just became kind of a uniquely Christian interpretation.
Yeah. And I know for me, of course, there's a lot of importance on this debate and like how to properly interpret this, because, a lot is happening in Isaiah 53. If this is messianic, this is like one of the clearest prophecies of what's going to happen in the entire Old Testament that I'm aware of. And I've read the entire Old Testament, so I hope I'm not forgetting a prophecy that's very clear in this one about what's going to come. It's like these who will die for our sins because of our sins. That's why he goes to the cross. By that death on the cross, it is that through which redemption and ransom for Israel comes, and victory that brings the nations to God. This is very important for not just what it is the cross was, but showing how the prophet saw what was coming and how they saw that this was going to go down.
Yeah. And so, you're going to continue to have people like Dan McClellan, Kip Davis, Josh Bowen, those guys poo-pooing this interpretation and saying, it's not talking about the Messiah. Ha, ha, ha. But, if you understand reception history of this text, and even if again, we have to look at this from not just a purely secular standpoint. If you see it as texts that have been inspired by God, so God is like the ultimate author.
Yeah.
And so he's able to bring together, these passages in Isaiah chapter 11 and Isaiah 53 and Jeremiah 23 and so on. Then it doesn't just sound like, you're artificially bringing these texts together. But if you don't agree with that presupposition, it's just going to sound not as impressive.
Yeah, but I mean, even if you just read because Isaiah, right, the biggest of the prophets, even if I would push back on this with skeptics myself personally, and I have done this, if they reject these later text as being divinely inspired and tied into Isaiah, they can't really reject Isaiah's use of other books that came before him. He's clearly using the same method himself. In just in that one Isaiah passage, he ties in the Exodus. He has potential references to some of the Psalms. There's just references through several books in just that one section of Isaiah, not including all the other parts of Isaiah where he's constantly hearkening back to other texts. So, yeah, like you've been saying, even from a secular standpoint, to evaluate this text honestly from the perspective of the ancient Jews, regardless of Christianity, is just not actually approaching it how it was written and meant to be interpreted.
If you want to learn more, I guess check out some of my videos. I go into more detail. This PowerPoint presentation here, which I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning here, but it's called Expectations of Coming Redemption. I go over some other texts too, like 2 Samuel 7 and Daniel chapter 7 and some other ones. I can't remember which ones. Because there were certain messianic texts, or there were texts from the Old Testament that were interpreted messianically at the time of Christ. And so Christianity kind of emerged at this time. And so you can't really understand the origins of Christianity without understanding this key development within Judaism that saw these texts as referring to the Messiah. So there's that aspect to it too, where if you just understand these as isolated texts that aren't really talking about the Messiah and all that stuff, then you're not going to appreciate how Christianity even emerged in the first place. Yeah, I suppose what you could say is that Christianity just adopted some of the misinterpretations of Judaism and all that. So, I mean, there's always going to be a way to poo-poo, the prophecies or whatever. But I find the more I study this stuff, the more compelling it really becomes to me.
Yeah, so I'm right there with you. That is the entire reason. It stemmed from my Trinitarian work, but that led me into a lot of my Messianic work, seeing all those connections in the Old Testament and how a lot of ancient Jews, the apostles, and others seem to be approaching and reading the text, how they were drawing these connections and showing this expectation of a coming redemption that is just such an important theme throughout the entire Old Testament. I think when you realize how they were not just writing, but reading and understanding what came before them, it's not only beautiful, but it just makes a lot more sense than some of the other approaches that a lot of skeptics and such try to bring to the text. Even if you don't agree with them and you think they're wrong, you can still think they're wrong and still accept that this was how these texts were understood and how this was seeming to be said. You can admit that a lot of these skeptics are wrong in how they're approaching the text and still not agree with us. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. But I've done a whole lot of work on my own channel that anyone interested in that can go watch. A lot of my work is very introductory into a ton of messianic themes, whether that's the suffering servant or the resurrection, the divine Messiah, all that. I give you a lot of places to go and dig further if you wish, if anyone's interested for that. But as I know we've run quite long and we're approaching the end here, is there anywhere else that you would like people to look at and try and find your work other than, of course, what's linked down in the doobly-doo below?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to my YouTube channel, you can find my academia page. So if you want to read some of my articles, I've got a lot of stuff available on there. So there's that. And yeah, I'll be coming out with some more articles here shortly, I hope. So much for those.
Well, I'm super excited for that. And thank you for your time so much. And I hope everyone enjoyed this. I hope this was edifying and good fruit for everybody. And we'll see you in the next video. And be sure to go like and subscribe to his channel right now. You have no excuse. This is a command, not a request.